So web applications from scratch, right? So here, let's get started. I'll just do a file new project, and we'll go with our web. Okay, so come down to C# web. Okay, so it's just a web application. I'm going to stick it. I made a little folder off the root of the C drive with the creative name new folder. WebAPI demo, reasonable name. Okay. Now I could give the solution a slightly different. No. That's fine. I'll leave it like that. No, thank you for the insight. We're good. Okay, so we'll go right to WebAPI. Just to talk about it again for a moment. Remember that you can start with just an MVC or WebAPI and then just check off, right, that you want support. Notice by default, just by selecting WebAPI, I do get the core references for both MVC and WebAPI, right? Because actually the default template for WebAPI also includes some standard MVC controllers just for the help system, right? Because there's some pages that are available so you can get some documentation about how the API works and what is exposed to the API. So the default template gives you both. Woohoo! Bonus all of a sudden already, right? I'm going to leave it on individual user accounts. We'll host in the cloud later on. That way I already have entity framework. And later on, if we get to the point where we want to incorporate some security, we'll have the plumbing in place for that, right? Alrighty. And we go for coffee. Alright, so here we are, standard approach. It doesn't look much different from MVC because truth is, it has all the plumbing. In fact, if we even look in here, we will already find a controller for home, right? Look familiar? Good old standard, notice, inheriting from just controller. Right? Action result, home page, and so on and so forth. So that's already there, the MVC plumbing is there. So let's just kind of back up a little. We remember how MVC works. We're going to start with a code first approach again. So I'll add some models, right? So I'll add a model, add a class, I should say. And I might as well do department employee. We'll add department, and I'll add employee as well. Okay, now just to steal a little bit of code, let me just come here. I'm going to grab some of the standard approach that we've done in the past, and we'll just talk about it, right? So I have some annotations, so I'll have to add my using, right? Control period again, or now the little light bulb is much easier. Remember, it used to just be the little rectangle in the first letter. It was really hard to hit it. Now we have a whole light bulb offering help to us, so I can just add the using easily this way. So then this is a standard approach we did last term. Remember the primary key, we have a naming convention. It could either just be ID or the name of the class with ID at the end. Otherwise, if you want to use a different name for the primary key, then you have to just annotate it, right, with key in square brackets, and that works fine too. But in this case, I'm just going to use employee ID, just as a little more explanatory for me. And there's my summary properties again. Full name, okay, a position, right, which is my job title, and then the department. Notice I'm using the Elvis Operator. You know about the Elvis Operator, right? Okay. Well, because we don't have the department name, that's why it's underlined. If you just focus, let me get rid of the underline first. Let me come back to department and add some code in here. Very, very simple. just my department ID and then a department name, right? Again, there's that little light bulb, see? So I can click, here's a little drop down arrow, add my using. Okay, so now there should be a little less underlining going on over here. All right, so Elvis, what does Elvis do for us? Well, if you haven't visited Elvis before, it's worth talking about because he's a very, very useful construct for us, new in C# version 6, right? So those two characters combined together. They call it Elvis. Now I'll get syntax errors doing this, but I want to help highlight why we call it the Elvis operator. All the underlining doesn't help. But anyway, just picture the two dots, the one under the question mark and then the period, as the eyes, and then you see the swirl of hair on his forehead, right? Come on, everyone's got to love Elvis, okay? So that's why they call it, honest, I'm not making this up, okay? That's honestly why they call it the Elvis operator. But basically what it does is it solves so much of the hassle we used to have with nullable. Right? Remember, we used the question mark as a short form for making something like a date time or even integer nullable, right? Because on their own, those aren't, okay? So we can do that. So it's kind of the same logic here. What the Elvis operator does is instead of having to write a whole if structure, you know, if and then check if something is null or not, and then, you know, handle it one way in code or another way, even if you do it all in, you know, that compact syntax for decision structures, well, you still have to do a decision structure. No more, right? The Elvis operator basically says, if you actually have something there, right, in this case, if there actually is a department, give me the department name. If department is null, if that object doesn't exist yet, don't worry about it. Yeah, I'm good, right? Don't give me any errors or exceptions or, you know, stop my application and with, you know, like I have a breakpoint or something. No, just ignore it and carry on, right? Just returns null then instead. So it simplifies a lot of the code we used to have to write with all of our if this and check if null there and so on. So it's very, very easy, right? So basically, my summary property in this case then is the job title, a comma, and then the name of the department, right? As long as there is actual department. Okay. Then I just have a first name and a last name, start date. Okay, so this is all the same kind of stuff we did in MVC. Notice that currency for salary, that's good. Job title, and away we go. So I have my public department. That's my actual navigation property. It's really this that lets Entity Framework know the relationship between employee and department. I don't actually have to have this, that foreign key integer. It just makes it easier for me to write code assigning a department, right? Because I didn't have to throw it the integer ID. I don't have to materialize a department object and add it to the department's collection, which is what I'd have to do if I didn't have just a simple integer foreign key value. Okay, so that's all good. That's pretty much the same as we've done in the past. Okay, let me go to department. Now here I just have my primary key, my department ID. Again, that naming convention working for me, ID at the end of the class name, and just a simple department name. What do you notice is missing that we used to have last term with MVC? Yeah, that thing at the bottom, that virtual I collection, right, of the child objects. So in this case, it would be the collection of employees. The reason I'm leaving it out, okay, actually there is a way you could include it if you really wanted to, but I'm leaving it out because when we go to start with a web service like this, serializing these collections into whether it's XML or JSON format, the serializer doesn't handle very well a circular reference. So if every department object has a collection of employees and employees have department contained in them, you get this circle going on, right? And the serializer just can't do it. You'll just constantly get these errors saying it was unable to serialize due to a circular reference, right? So the other one is absolutely necessary, right? We have to have, in order to establish with code first, we have to have that child department, okay, as a property in the employee. This is optional to have that collection. It was a nicety for us when we were doing our MVC apps because then, you know, we could maybe bring up the details view, for example, of a doctor and show right on the same view all the patients assigned to that doctor and so on and so forth, right? Yeah, it's nice to be able to dot include, right, that child collection of objects, or collection of child objects, sorry, right? But it wasn't really a necessity. And because of the limitations of having to serialize everything to, you know, a data packet, right, for transmission in the background through HTTP requests, JSON format being the most compact available at this point in time, you know, it's really not worth it. If you really have to do that, there is another way to do it, right? You actually just, instead of using your actual model object, you create a view model or data transfer object, as you were just working with in that last tutorial. And then you can populate those and then send them down, right? So there is ways to get that done if it becomes vital. In the meantime, simplest fix is just leave it out, right? Later on, I will show you how in an MVC application, if you really want to be able to use that on a regular MVC view through a controller, there are some other settings you can change so it won't cause an error, but you still won't be able to actually, from the actual WebAPI controller, get that dot include, because it'll still give you a circular reference. Anyway, long story to explain that. I hope I explained it well enough. Basically, the circular reference just won't work for what we need to do at this point. Okay, but I have my two classes. That's good. All right, so one thing I am going to need, though, is, of course, I have to get a data access layer going, right? Because I am going to use migrations and everything else. So let me just come up here. I'll add a DAL folder. So that's just a regular, everyday, vanilla folder. Nothing special. Data access layer. And, you know, I'm going to show it a little differently. This is what I've started to do in the Prog 1612. Organize everything into subfolders, even under DAL. So later on we're going to have our whole security system, that identity system, and our production tables. So why not have everything organized from the get-go? So maybe this is my company, right, entity. So I will add yet another folder, making another namespace, of course, in the end, but that's okay. Oh, new folder one. I guess I can just rename it here. Company entities. Now that's ent. Good enough for short. Okay. So everything related to talking to the company, I'm going to put under this folder, including the migrations, right, as well as my context object. So that's where I'll do next. I will actually add a context object. I'll add a class here. Okay, so I guess I'll call it company entities. Oh, come on, go away. Good thing I stopped short on naming the folder, otherwise that'd cause confusion having a class the same name as a namespace. Okay, company entities, and of course this is the one that's going to inherit from DB context, which it doesn't understand yet until, hey, I'll let my light bulb help me, system.data.entity, right? There we go. So inside here, I just need my my DB sets for department and employee. And if I want, I can, you know, add my override here to the constructor, or sorry, to the on model creating. Oh, need to do some control period work. Add the using for the models namespace, the models folder, right? Then it knows what a department and employee is. And there's another control period needed here to add the using for system, data, entity, model configuration dot conventions. Good thing this is here to help me so I don't have to memorize all this stuff, right? Okay, there we go. That's where I get rid of my one-to-many cascade delete, right? The pluralization is just personal preference. That's not really important. Okay, so that is good enough for now. But while we're here looking at this, yes, question?
Constructor, don't we need to construct it to the default connection? If we only have one connection string, will it not matter?
Okay, I have one connection string right now, for sure, and I can just use it. I could use it for both DB context, the application DB context is there, and this one. The problem with doing that, I'm not sure if this is what you're asking or not, is when I go to actually put this up to Azure, I can't tell it to run both sets of migrations with one connection string. So I fool it by using two separate connection strings that are identical with just different names. But yeah, if I add a constructor for the actual context class itself, then I can override and use whatever name I want, right, for the actual connection string. There's other things we might put in that constructor as well. Okay, I'm going to grab this bit of code and throw it in, and we'll talk about it. Right. So here's my constructor. Oh, change the name. And if I want it, I can have it use the same default connection that is already in my web config file. That's the connection string was created by the project template, right? Okay. So when I build my company entities DB context class, I can pass in the name for the connection string here, which is just what you were talking about. This line of code I have commented out. That's the one that if I put it in place, it writes every SQL command that is executed against the database out to the output window. So that's kind of useful if you want to see, well, what is the actual SQL being generated when I say .save changes on my contact, right? Helps you analyze things sometimes. I don't normally leave it on all the time, but I often use it in class to demonstrate the difference between lazy loading and eager loading now. So you can see that with lazy loading, you have to go back and do yet another query for each and every child that you want to materialize. So if you're doing that, like doctor.include patients, right? You might show the doctor, but then every time you loop through and pull up the data for a new patient, it's a separate query. Whereas if you do eager loading, then it doesn't have to do that. It gets it all in one query, right? Anyway, so that's there if you want to play with that. These are those two settings I said would allow me to have the virtual collection of, in this case, employee objects in the department. Having those two configuration settings made. So lazy loading enabled. In other words, I wouldn't allow the system to come back and ask for it later. They'd have to ask for it up front. Having these means that a regular MVC controller, I could do the same kind of trick we did last year, where we could do .include, but having this here still won't help my web API. But I'll leave it there in case I do end up adding an MVC controller later on as well. Okay, so that's the little bit of magic that helps us get around that, but we're still limited. We can't do .include on a parent object for child objects for an actual web API controller. Oh boy, covering a lot of material quickly here. I hope you don't mind this fast review. So I'll save all that. Just double check that my connection string is here, right? And so default connection. So my database is going to use this string, right, which is fine. Oh, of course here, right, there's that issue I talked about earlier that the login, if you try to use the default installation of LocalDB, for some reason, just how the imaging process works, it gets created before the actual account is created. It seems that's what happens. So even the administrator account will get a login failure, right, because it wasn't created by the administrator. So our workaround for that is I'm going to change it to, I could use any name I want, but for consistency, I'll call it NC. What does that stand for? Niagara College. See my cape flowing behind me as I say? Oh, okay, all right. Niagara College, LocalDB. All right, and that should work once I actually create that. Ooh, reminds me, I better do it. That's easy. I'll go back to Blackboard because I put up a little explanation here right in our content categories, my catch-all for resources and so on. Fix for the LocalDB login issue. And here is the one line of code you have to run. And I say in here, I should change it, but I'm going to leave it just in case. You have to run this in elevated command prompt. Fancy word for saying run as an administrator. You don't. I found out you don't. I think because we're all basically set up as an administrator on the image, so we don't seem to have to. I can just come down here, ask Cortana for a CMD. Command prompt. Thank you, Cortana. Paste in my command, press enter. Oh, go away, Cortana. Sorry, she heard me say her name, and my phone has Hey Cortana. Yes. Sorry. It's trained just to me though, so don't have everybody in the room start shouting out Hey Cortana, because it's only my voice it's trained for. All right. Okay, so that's done. That's good. We notice local DB instance NC local DB created with version 13.0. So 13 is actually, I think, SQL Server 2016. Yeah, because 12 was 2014. Anyway, all right, so we're good. So I'll be able to use that connection string now. All right, so we're almost ready. Yeah, I think that's it. So I'll get my package manager console up. And now I already have Entity Framework installed because I did the default template with the security system, so that'll be there. So now I'm ready to enable migrations, right? Now remember, I will get the error message because there's two contexts it sees in the system, the security one and the one I just added. Okay. Fortunately, you know, tab is a great, it works not just after the dash, works all the time. Takes a moment. Okay, enable migrations. I probably should type a little bit more before.
Just enable everything.
Enable everything. That's great. Okay. So just to remind you how that works, I'll get a message saying, wait, I know which one you want me to enable here, because there's two of them. More than one context type, right? And unfortunately it tells us what to use. So for my company entity, okay, use this command, right? So I'll just copy that, paste that in. Just gonna move this up on the screen. Now, but I'm not done, right? And actually this is a little verbose. I don't actually have to say the whole thing. I could just say context type name company entities, right? That extra qualification is not really required, but there's no point really in taking it out. But I do want to add one more stipulation, right? If I did this right now, we would create a folder called migrations in the root of the whole project. And that's where you'd run into possible conflicts, because to keep migrations separate for different context objects, they each have to be in their own folders, right? So what I can do is I can go dash migrations directory, so I'll use the tab to help me write that. It just wrapped around because my font's so big. Migrations directory, and then I just pass the name or the path that I want to use. So I'll go with DAL / company ent / migrations. Okay, so this time should work, and it will actually create that subdirectory. There we go. I see it's already there. Right, so you see over here under company ent, it made a migrations folder. Right now it just has my configuration file. Okay, they're enabled. So I could add my first migration while we're here. Now those that remember from last term, if I also enable migrations on security, then from then on I always have to be saying dash context type name or configuration type name, right? Every time I give any command. But if I hold off on that, then because there's only one that actually is enabled, then I don't have to specify, right? There's no confusion anymore for the next commands I want to give for code first migrations, because there is only one DB context where I have enabled migrations, right? So I can just say add migration initial create, and it should scaffold that first migration. Remember, yellow is not an error, it's just a warning letting me know there's a snapshot and so on. So there's my department table going to be created, my employee table, right? My primary key and my foreign key, okay, department, ID, away we go. All right, so we're looking good. We're ready to go. Now, I might throw in some seed data. Let me see if I can find some. Hang on a second. Okay, so departments and employees, right? I have a little twist in this one for you. So if I go to my configuration file, down here in the seed, okay, I was a little tired of just having a limited number of sample data records, right? So what I did is I played around with my code here a little bit. That's because this is expecting my code. Remember that I gave you to, I made everyone in the class sing, right? Because we wanted to be able to see our entity validation errors. Oh, wouldn't it be nice if we, yeah, you remember that. A few heads nodding. Okay, I guess I could throw that in as well. I have it here. Okay. Wrapper for save changes, giving us all the feedback we might want. So I'll just stick that up here between the constructor for the class and my seed override. Obviously, a few control periods required. I think there's at least one more. Yeah, string builder. Surprisingly, it doesn't have system.txt. There we go. Okay. So it doesn't know what a department is, so I'll have to add a namespace for the models folder. And there should be one more, I think. It doesn't know what a list is, believe it or not. So again, a very common one using system collections generic. There, because a list is a generic object. We can pass classes to it. All right, so just to talk a bit about this seed code, what I did here is I'm making 4 departments. Simple, right? That's nothing different from what we've done in the past. But for the employees, well, I created some string arrays so we could randomly go through and combine every possible first name with every possible last name, right? Just in a loop so that I could get a little bit more data. Okay? So that's all I've done in my sample code here. All right. So just a little if, and making sure that we haven't run out, and then using the random number generator, randomly coming up with a start date and time, okay, based on a initial one to measure from, and looping through all the last names and first names, basically instantiating or creating an employee object, okay, with these randomly selected first and last names, a randomly selected job title as well, and a randomly selected salary between a range of values, and a randomly selected start date using add days, subtracting, you know, somewhere between today and 1500 days in the past. Okay, just to create some a little bit more fun-looking seed data. Right? Yeah, I'm sure you've done this kind of thing yourself because you were frustrated only having 5 patients or whatever. Okay, there we go. So that should work. Oh, I got an extra curly brace or not enough one. So it says I'm expecting another one. Probably my copy paste going on there. All right, so let's check if I build. Build. Build succeeded. Woohoo! All right, so going back to Package Manager. I should be ready now. I've got my seed data ready. I have my migration enabled, my first initial create. I should be able to do an update database. See, tab helps. Oh, I didn't do my dash verbose, sorry, but that's okay. So I applied my migration, ran my seed, and so as we know, I should, if it doesn't lie to me, click don't lie to me a couple times, I should have data in my app data. It's that big long default name, but I never change it, so that's okay. So there's my department and employee table. Let's just show table data here. See all the employees we have by looping through, right? Lots and lots of employees. So a little bit more sample data with randomly selected jobs and departments and so on. Okay, so that's good. That's just kind of a review of a lot of what we did last year anyway. But at least we have something to work with now. So at this stage, it might as well have been an MVC application, right? But what we're going to do is when I add a controller this time, I will add controller. It was there in our next dialog box all along last year. We just never selected it. Or did we? I think we might have done one example near the end of the term. WebAPI 2 controller with actions using Entity Framework. Okay? So very much the same as making a regular standard MVC controller, but you'll see it inherits from a different class. So, which context? My company entities. I can do department. And very important, I want to select async controller actions. I know we didn't always do that when we were running MVC, but you know, especially with a web API, truth is, just about any time you're communicating across the internet, you really should be doing it asynchronously. I know we kind of cheated a little because our website was being hosted on the same server as the database and everything else, you know, but we really should get used to working asynchronously. It makes debugging a real pain in the rear end sometimes, but it's really not too bad in this case. So asynchronous actions, please. Now there's no views being scaffolded, just the controller, right? Let me just do the other one. We can have a look at both. So I'll add another controller, WebAPI controller with the goods, and this time for the employees. Asynchronous, yes, thank you. Okay, so just looking here at departments, right? Notice that, yes, indeed, it inherits from API controller. So it's a similar class in many respects, but it is specifically for API, right? And for the routing, I should maybe mention that as well. In app start, we'll have a web API config. By the way, if you later on you just add a web API controller to an existing MVC, it will create this class for you. Comes up a little help file and a couple other manual changes you have to make to use web API along with your MVC. But basically, there's just a slightly different mapping available for all the calls to the API controllers. It looks for API / and then the controller name, right? And then the ID. Okay? So we'll see that in action in a few minutes. So what do we have here? Basically, we create familiar, right? Our DB object, just our DB context. And this is the same one that we would use if we also had some MVC controllers and views working with the same data, right? It's the same context, whether we're using the Web API controller or if we were doing the MVC controller. But down here, instead of returning view, having action results, returning views all the time, you see basically what we're returning is data, an iQueryable collection of department objects. Okay, the action method is get departments. The link query is just db.departments. Right? Now it is linked, so we could do, you know, .where, .order by, then by, whatever we wanted to change how the data is delivered by the Web API, and away we go. Down here is get one department passing the ID. Right? So if you know the ID, that primary key, integer identity of the department, you can pass it in. And notice that we're just using our find like we did last year, but it is .find async, because this is all set up to work asynchronously, right? Which is why it also has the keyword await. Be patient. I'm asynchronous, but I will get there eventually, right? So find async, passing in the ID, and that will just get materialize our department object, and then we can return it. OK just means we'll get that's the HTTP status. Will be OK, and then we'll actually bundle up the department object, right? Now, how do I know, will it be JSON or XML or Atom format?
Isn't it specified within the request that you ask for JSON or HTML or?
Yes, that is the correct answer. We don't have to care. In the controller, we're ready to give them the data however they ask for it. So in the old days, you used to have to do a lot of extra programming to say, okay, well, if they're asking for this, I'll prepare it this way, and so on and so forth. Nah, none of that, okay? .NET looks after it all for us now. So whatever the request comes in, they will ask for, I want the data in, say, JSON, right? Okay, no problem. It will just automatically return it in JSON. We don't have to do any extra programming. That's built in now, okay? All right, so a few other, we talked about all the different actions that HTTP supports, you know, put, post, get, and so on. So you notice those were both gets, right? So here's our put. What do we use the put verb for? Update, exactly, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to actually, you know, we'll get the idea, but we can materialize with our default model binder, same one we used to use for model binding in MVC. It will just take all the form data, try to materialize a department object, and then down here, as long as we don't have a bad request, right, we will actually just grab that object, set its state to modified, and just save changes async. Okay, so you'll see the async showing up here and there. That's a subtle difference. It just means that we're actually handling everything asynchronously. All set for concurrency exceptions and everything else anyway. All right. So the next one is post, which we know is it's an insert, right? So with a post, again, we materialize the department, right? And basically just add it to the department's DB set of our context object, and away we go. So it's very familiar code, not all that different from the kind of code we wrote with MVC. The most fundamental thing is the fact that we're actually just not returning views, but we're just returning data. And the data will come in whatever format the client application is asking for, right? So let's just wrap up this. We're gone on for 40 minutes almost. I'll pick a browser, any browser. I'll pick Chrome. Let's run our application. Not surprisingly, remember there was a home controller, right? So by default, when I load this up, I should, once the nagging stops about Adobe, I should actually see a home page, right? A index view of my home controller. No, don't show me again. There we go. So here's that home, right? And away we go. So there is this link in the navigation setup to give me, this is basically a help file for the API. So when I click it, I just get some documentation essentially on what API calls and how to format them are going to work, right? So some of them here are for, because there is security, right? So there were controllers already in place for security, so it's scaffolded some API calls for them as well, right? But here's departments and employees. So the API/departments should return a whole list of departments. /ID would give us the one we've identified by the ID. Okay, put, post, and delete, and then the same thing for employees, right? So you can have a look. Values, I should have removed that, but that's okay. It's not going to hurt anything. And now, if you click on this, you don't actually run it. What you do is get even further definition explaining, you know, how the data is going to look and so on. So it's a whole documentation system that's built in to this template as well, right? To these MVC views that are scaffolded as part of the process. But to actually execute any of these and utilize them, all I have to do is come up to the URL. Well, maybe even steal this so far. I'll just open a new tab here, and I'll actually just go API/departments. Right? So if I push enter there we go. Now you might say, wait a second, that's not JSON, that's XML. You're right, because that's what Google by default asks for, right? No problem. Okay, but we see how it's laid out, department/department with the two properties, okay, the ID and then the department name, all laid out, looping through all the departments. If I did /3, then I just get department ID 3, right? So very commonsensical. Commonsensical, is that a word? Well, we just made it up. Okay, I'm going to stick with it. Easy to understand looking at the XML. Now, some browsers, but I think will default to JSON. For example, if I were to, well, let me just go back one to the whole list. If I grab this URL while it's still running, let's just open, for example, Internet Explorer. Paste that in. I think, yeah, see, I'm getting prompted at the bottom to open a file. Okay, it thinks you want to download a file because it's returning this data. So different browsers behave differently. So your client, of course, you're going to have your own way of accessing the data, right? So it will decide, and you can, in code, say whether you want JSON or whatever. Now I believe, notice that it's .json. That's the file extension for this download here. So I can click open, and I think by default, yeah, it opens it here in Visual Studio. Actually, this is kind of a useful thing. If you can bear with me for 5 more minutes. So all the data is here. Of course, I can right-click and say unminify. That's a nice thing. And then I see all the JSON data, right? Let me do the same thing here. Don't enable. Let me get the employees as well. Oh, come on. Oh, that's in Google. And plus I had something wrong. Oh, I stopped running. That's why. Duh. Okay, I'm going to actually just select Internet Explorer for a second. We'll run it again. Brain fart. Sorry. Apologize. Okay, API/employees. And once again, it's downloading a file. I'll just open it here. I can unminify, and away we go. So, just to see what it looks like with a little bit more data in it, right? I got lots and lots of employees. Now, one thing I could do, let's just go back to my controller for a second. I should have done this earlier. But you guys are enjoying this, right? Okay. Let's go to my employees controller. And remember, I can't eagerly load in the child collection, but for each employee, I have that navigation property. So what I can do is here, just for even for my get, I can go .include. So I want all the details about the department, not just the department ID, right? Loaded into my each and every employee object. So E goes to E dot department. Right? That's just a simple dot include, a simple link extension method. So now let me just save that again. I'll have to run it again, sorry, because I stopped. Before we do, notice here, if we just look at the existing file I have, right, all it has is department ID. Department is null, right? The actual object is department is null because we didn't materialize the child object in this navigation property, just the ID is there. Okay, so this time going back here, yeah, okay. API, come on. Employees. What if I can open 2 files with the same name? Yeah, it did. Okay, well, unminify, and now you see. Okay, so there's a hierarchical arrangement now, so we still have that simple integer, but then we also have departments that are being null. See the curly brace, right? So the curly brace are surrounding all the properties of the object itself, so we have the department ID and the department name. So we've eagerly loaded all that extra data about each one. So the last little thing I'm going to demo before we stop today, because we'll leave doing the client, okay, maybe for tomorrow. But I have this much so far. let's suppose for a minute that all I have is this file, right? Or I'm maybe going to be talking to a web API that I didn't create. You and I know right now, I can come over here down to the, say, the employee class, and there we go. I have all the details on the model, right? But that's not always real world. In the real world, often you're connecting to a web API, a web service of some sort, giving you JSON data or XML data, but we'll stick with JSON for now. And, you know, how do you then create a C# class to hold this data if you don't have the class already? Let me show you. This is really neat. Okay. In fact, well, if I had time, I'd make it a separate project, so you know there's nothing up my sleeve going on here. But let me just go Control-A, Control-C to copy all that, right? Now let's suppose I was in a different project altogether. It would work the same way. If I right-click and say Add Class, and of course I know that these are employees, right? But you know, that's the one thing JSON doesn't tell you is the name of the root object. It's not there anywhere in the JSON file. These are all the properties of each root object, but you don't have a name. So I'm just going to call it the employee, just so it's different, right? Because I can't have two classes of the same name in here. Okay, so there's my class for the employee, right? Okay, well what I'm going to do is I can just even delete that. Under Edit, it used to be that all the tutorials would tell you to go online, find these different utilities, like there's JSON to C# and different ones like that. You don't have to do that anymore. It's built into Visual Studio, right? All I have to do is come down here to Edit, paste Special. Look at that. Paste XML as classes or JSON as classes. So I just took that raw JSON data that came. Let's pretend I know nothing about the actual code, the database design, anything else. All I have is that JSON data being returned. I can just come here, paste this JSON. Look at that. So it created a department class, right, with department ID and name, and all the properties. Now it just calls it class 1, right, because it doesn't have a name for the root object. So I know that's the employee or whatever. Okay. So the root object is just there really because it has to guess at something. But we know enough about, you know, our request to the API was /API/employees, right? So I can say, well, that's probably the employee then. Okay. Whatever name I want to give it, I can work with that. But that's pretty neat, isn't it? That you can actually then materialize a complete C# class. Now, of course, you don't have the same annotations and everything, but truth is, most client applications don't care about those annotations. Those are useful in an MVC, right? They help you get, the error messages and everything else. They help you define the database object string length for strict text fields and so on. But they have no real significance to most clients, right? It's just the properties themselves. So I thought I'd share that with you, that now it's built in Visual Studio, that paste special, really useful. Okay, good little tip for you. All right, I think even in the online tutorials, that textbook one, the 80, there's one point where he's using somebody's, I think was it IMDb or some music service or something, APIs.
Yeah, for the album.
For the album one, yeah, and so he does that JSON to, that website where you convert a JSON to a C# class. Now it's built in Visual Studio. So.
No, the Hero Explorer. That's what he uses it for.
Oh, the Hero Explorer?
Takes it from like
Okay. Anyway, built in. There you go. All right, so that's enough for today.